Now it is? All right, that's great. Let's go. No, it's not. I told you, Caleb.
There you go.
Yeah, it's on there now. Let's roll. All right, so with that, right? Why would we even be asking this question? See, everybody's checking their phone now. We got it. We got sound now. Told you, Caleb, you didn't. I'm just picking. Come on. It's Kara's fault tonight. Yep. Everybody turn around and look at Kara. Yeah. All right, we got that over with. Now you feel the pressure that I feel when it don't work. Or Anthony or somebody else feels. Why would we ask this question, right? Hopefully everybody's got sound. Welcome. Come on, let's move on. Right? This question that was asked, right? Is it wrong or a sin for a woman to speak in church? Why would this question be asked? Come on, I know it's a small group, but some. Okay.
That's what I thought. I guess I read this. It says you're not supposed to speak.
Okay, so. Okay. All right, so Miss Amanda says that in the Bible there is some conversation that's written down that talks about this very thing. Okay? Anybody else? Nobody else? Y'all gonna make me do a lot of talking? Okay. Okay, maybe in a different setting, right? Or in some, right? In lots of cases, maybe that this was a practice or a teaching inside the church.
I think there's more of a movement in the world about equality.
Okay.
From a gender standpoint.
Okay. So,
Men and women, there should be no difference as far as what they do, how they do it,
okay.
roles, relationships.
Great. So with that being said, that Bobby Joe says that in the world that we're living in, right, there is that Me Too movement, right, where we're seeing gender equality really being pushed to the point that, you know, we see lots of those things, even if it's a woman's movement, right? Lots of this conversation, lots of this talking coming up inside of our world today. Anybody else? Oh man, here we go then. Jody said he's watching it, Kimberly. All right, so has anybody grew up, right? I know that Kimberly mentioned that. Has anybody else maybe grown up feeling that way to where that this is a questionable statement inside of the church? Or maybe you felt like that as part of growing up inside the church that, hey, wait a minute, there is a proper place or a proper order that should be followed or established?
I just know when I was little, I mean, be Sunday school teacher. And I mean, you know, they play piano and sing in the choir. It was special to sing, no praying, no. Even I remember going into youth, and the lady was my true youth pastor. So her husband, her and her husband had a title.
Mm-hmm.
Even though she was teaching.
Okay.
That's kind of like what I was thinking about it this afternoon, and I thought.
There we go. Good. We're thinking. That's what,
My Sunday school teachers were all women.
most Sunday school teachers, all women.
And I never felt like it was wrong for a woman to speak up in church, but I think back when we were growing up, we didn't have as much open discussion like we do now.
Right.
Like Sunday night was more of a sermon, like Sunday morning.
Preaching, teaching.
And we didn't, but, you know, if a woman was asked to pray, we probably would have thought that was very,
Very odd.
but just for a woman to speak, I don't.
Okay. So So with that being said, right, maybe that's the route that we need to kind of look at from this standpoint of this question, right? When we think of the word speak, because if you all remember 2 weeks ago when we read this question or we pulled it out of the hat, that was the first thing that Joey asked was, are they referring to preaching or what do they mean, right? So you guys see the question the way that it was wrote. So I want to clarify on the word speak if I can, right? That's where I really want to try to hone in on, right? And Miss Amanda alluded to where I really want us to go with a particular passage, right, which is coming from the Apostle Paul, New Testament church, in a letter that he wrote to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 2. We're going to be looking at this, right, pulling it out of this letter, and then we'll kind of go from there. This starts in verse 8, right? So if you've got a Bible and you want to do it, or not, we'll have it up on the screen. If you're at home, right, grab yours and follow along. I think, did I do 8 through 15? Is that what I did, Caleb? Okay, 8 through 11. Well, maybe I didn't. Well, I'm going to back up then. So I want to do 8. That's okay. We'll just wait till we get there. We'll start at verse 8. It says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands, without anger or quarreling. Likewise, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. Verse 11, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Oh my gracious, right? There's 32 sermons right here in this text, and we cannot cover them all tonight. I wanted to read this entire text because we begin to see a little bit about what Paul is talking to this early church, which is so very important, right? And if we were to look on back, we can see that he even addresses issuing, praying, and coverings, head coverings, all of those things. We don't have time to get in that tonight, but there are places, plenty of places in the world, right? India, for one, where I've been, where as people begin to pray, all women have a head covering on. Or they will cover their head. If they don't actually have a head covering, they will take and place something over top of their head. That's a great question that we can get into some other time, right? We have to realize as Paul is writing this letter that there was some uneasiness inside of the church that he is talking to with young Timothy. Right? There are lots of things, even if we will remember inside as he's writing to the church at Corinth, right, in Corinthians, that there were all kinds of things that were taking place inside the church. Lots of chaos. There were people that were coming in and they were speaking in tongues, and it wouldn't just be one person, it would be several people, and they would get up and do it one time, and there would be another group that would begin to prophesy, and then another one would begin up, and all this was happening inside the church in just complete chaos. So you can just imagine being in your worship service, right, or wherever that may be, and you can be there and then 20 people just getting up and doing their own thing. I mean, can you imagine in our day and time if 20 people just got up during a service and just started talking or speaking in tongues or praying out loud or exercising some spiritual gift inside of a service? Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I'm saying lots of us would probably be weirded out, right? We would begin to look and say, what's wrong with these people? Or what Kool-Aid are they drinking, right? What in the world is taking place inside the church? And that's what Paul is talking about right here. Except now he is specifically addressing women. Sexual sin was huge in the New Testament church. Surprise, surprise. It's no different now, right? It's here, right? But to the point that women were coming in and they were dressing in seductive ways. Oh my gracious. I know everybody's starting to get uncomfortable. Come on, it's all right, here we go. Right? They were dressing in ways that was not godly, right? He even says, hey, that you need to be respectable with this apparel, modesty, right? He's saying, hey, self-control. And then he mentions, not with braided hair and adorned in jewelry. Now we know that there are lots of denominations that follow closely and hold true to this. Makeup. Anna Kate, if I catch you with makeup on, you're out of here. Right? And I say that, right, in all joking, right? But we know that there are lots of denominations that hold true to these teachings, to the things, right? To where that there are no gold or jewelry or earrings or any of those things to draw attention, because these ladies were coming in with the wrong motive. Right? To the point that they were truly stumbling blocks to those that they were around. And then on top of that, that they were dressed and acting in such a way that, hey, the men were finding what they were doing to be so appealing that these women were taking it a step further, and they began to exercise authority. They began to stand up and speak, and just because she looked pretty nice, hey, we wouldn't stop her. We would allow her to continue to talk, and before we know it, the church was rampant with lots of things being talked and taught about, and there was no control. So Paul is trying to encourage young Timothy, hey, wait a minute, you need to make sure that you get a handle on what's going on. I know this word submissive right now is one that definitely we don't want to hear about, or we don't want to talk about a lot, especially when it comes to when we start thinking about letting a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. Oh my gracious, right? Especially in this new movement that we see being portrayed. I want to make sure that we understand wholeheartedly that this is not about being competent as a woman or as a man. Right? Paul is not saying, hey, women have no right to be able to talk because they're uneducated or they're not competent in order to be able to teach. We've just heard just from a few comments inside of here, and we can look at our own church, right? Most of our Sunday school teachers are what? That was your audience participation. Women, right? Most people that bring our children to church, most things that driving force behind lots of what goes on inside the church are women. Does God have a place and a proper procedure in order? All of these things, yes. But the last thing that I want us to do is look at this and say women are not allowed to because they're not competent is not at all where God is at. Because it says that He created man and woman, right? He created them in His image. Right? We can go all the way back to the garden and see exactly of where we're at. We just need to make sure that we understand exactly this word speak. Right? That we grab a hold of this conversation. So, as we look at this, it says, verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach. So if we just read that one statement, we would already be saying, hey, wait a minute, we're completely offline because, hey, we're letting lots of women teach. But where we must go a little bit further at, right, is or to exercise authority over a man. Now here is the most important part of this question that we're asking, right? Is that, do I believe that women have no place for teaching inside the church? Absolutely not, right? Right? According to God's word, we can even look at young Timothy. Paul even writes to him and says, hey, wait a minute. We know that you came to faith because of your grandmother and your mother who taught you. We can look at countless people's lives who have been influenced by godly women, right? We can look at the story in of itself of the Bible. We can look at Jesus' lineage and see that women have played an important part in the church. We can look at the New Testament, and in 16 different occasions, as we talked about with deacons a little while back ago, that Paul pointed out that, hey, women were important parts in this servant role with the New Testament church, teaching, leading, helping. But the one thing that we need to understand of what this exception to the rule is when it comes to these terms of classification, and that is in leading, preaching, teaching over top of a man. Now I know, right? I know as we hear that, right, it becomes very, very hard because once again we think that it is a disqualification. It is something that we're saying that women are not good enough because that's the last thing. Right? We need to understand that we're talking specifically in the settings of pastoring, preaching, teaching the entire church. This is the context that we're talking about, that if we were to say, is it wrong or is it a sin? This is the classification that we need to hold true to. In every other case, we know. Right? Even if we were to look at Titus 2, hold on a second. Yeah, Titus 2, 3, and 4, right? He says, older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good. Who are they to teach? And so train the young woman to love their husbands and children. Right? To be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, submissive to their own husband, submissive to their own husband, that the word of God may not be reviled. To the points, right? That we want women working, teaching inside the church. Absolutely. Right? We know our kids programs. We know through all of these areas. We know that women teaching women. We know all of these cases are the greatest examples, and we want to encourage that, right? Even speaking, right? That's the hardest thing about this question, because what if whoever we want to use, right? We'll use Amanda because she's standing out tonight because she's wearing a hat. Everybody look at Amanda's hat. And church at that. If you're at home, you don't see it, but she is doing it. I done got that stuff messed me up. Good job, man. Where was we going with that? Yeah, Titus, right? So what was we saying now? Come on, help me. I done went blank. Teaching in the church. I don't even know where I was going with my analogy now. That's done got me messed up. Man. Miss Jean says what? Come on, hold on a second.
Miss Jean says, I think that God has called men and women to teach and speak if truly following the Lord, but man should lead.
Okay.
And then she says, I think it is a sin for a woman to preach in church.
Okay.
I don't think.
She doesn't think.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get to that. All right. So that's where we've got to be extremely careful, right? Is as we hear those things, is that we want to make sure that, sure, our opinions are great. We want to hold true to God's word, and that is the thing that I want to try to make sure. Because if we were to use Amanda and her, in this case a minute ago, right? If Amanda decides to speak inside of this church, what would be appropriate speaking? Absolutely.
We even talked about the woman joining or spoken in church.
Absolutely.
We're not preaching the word, I guess,
Absolutely. So if we're looking at it from the standpoint of sharing a testimony, right, of giving, of speaking on something that has done, right, what God has done in and through your life, if we're doing that, if it is a women's conference and there is women that are predominantly being ministered to, where we have to be extremely careful at, right, is that once it becomes exercising authority, right? And God has given us authority according to the scriptures, right? And with that, we have to be extremely careful. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not great women preachers or teachers that are actively involved in all kinds of ministry. But where we do have to be careful is that once they start making it more than that very thing, it doesn't mean that, hey, you can't listen to someone that shares and talks and does that. But if we were to sit underneath of a, right? Let's just say that I leave this church tomorrow, and if I do, is this church going to look for a woman pastor? Right, according to the scriptures, right, and that's where we have to be the clearest, right? It's not that we're saying that women are incapable. It's not that we're saying that they can't, right? But God has designed, right, and I know it's the hardest part sometimes for us to grab a hold of, is this context of male role and this woman role when it comes to leadership in the church, right? Eldership is what we're talking about. Right? Eldership in and of itself is preaching, teaching, right? Bishop, elder, overseer. This is an office of a man only. And that is really, really, really hard, right? I know that it is, but do we see examples? Are there churches that there are women pastors? Sure. We can look at certain denominations, right? Methodist Church, Episcopalian Church. We can see lots of different other examples that are out in our world where it is being used, right? But just because we see it being used, does that make it right?
Well, it's not a belittling of women by any shades of the imagination. It's a different role.
Right.
You know, it's the same way when you look at God's design for marriage. You know, many do not like that design for marriage, but when done in God's context and God's way, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. But then, you know, when we do things God's way, man, it works out wonderfully. When we don't, I see it as not it's just a different road. Different road, God's the author of it. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Reed.
I was going to say the nations around Israel were different than God's kingdom. He set it up in a certain way. He was making sure there was identification between his people and the ways of the nations around them, because they had a lot of, like Jezebel, she had a big influence in the kingdom.
Absolutely.
And there was a lot of harlotry. There was a lot of stuff that was going on in the nations, and God wanted no excuse for anybody to say, you're doing the same thing as us.
Absolutely. And it's so important, right? Because we look at this terminology and our world is placing such emphasis on so many things that we almost get into defensive mode, right? Because the easiest thing for us to do is to say, well, that was just the way it was back in those days, right? And that was the way that God designed it during then because of, you know, men were held more higher than women, but that's not the case at all, right? We can go all the way back to the garden and see exactly the design, right, of what God had and what he intended for it to be. And then we can also see that the fall and what it caused and the curse that came along with it, right? That we can see the design of the enemy. And now when we exercise these things or we even talk about these things, it almost puts us into a defensive mode to really take us away from where it is, and it's really sidetracking the church, right? Because sure, we can operate outside of God's will all the time, but is that where we really want to be? No, right? So that doesn't mean that if one day that someone stands up and they read a scripture and it's a woman in here and she shares a devotion, does that mean that we're operating outside of God's will? No. Come on, let's get that off the table, right? We're talking about consistently sitting underneath of Joyce Meyer week in and week out from this pulpit. And I'll just use her for an example because she was pastoring a local church. I don't think that she does any longer. I think she's just evangelist now. But if you've ever watched any of her weekend events, right, there are tons of men sitting inside there. Correct. But lots of women say, I want my husband to come, and lots of men like her. I don't even want to get into that. Come on. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I know. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. Question for you. Yeah.
But Kyle, I think,
Great.
and I know a passage that you looked at was in 1 Corinthians,
Yes,
11,
come on.
Talked about the head covering.
Yep.
But when Paul teaches that, Paul says, it is every wife who prays and prophesies with her head uncovered is dishonoring her head, which he's addressing a specific issue, but he's not saying don't pray and prophesy because women were obviously doing this.
Absolutely.
It's just the way in which you do it.
Absolutely.
So there was a design that God ordained and wanted us to
Yes.
follow. And I see it so much, and the thing that I think we have to separate is the church from everything else. Because I think it's okay, you see
Yeah.
women now that are becoming coaches.
Yeah.
NFL college, which is fine. Or you even go as far as government officials and all of this. But we're joining the church straight in with it and saying it's just like everything else. And the church is not like everything else. The church has to be set apart from everything else.
Right.
And I think it's so easy to just slide in and say, hey, this needs to change too.
Yep. And that is the key, right? And that's where that our heart has to be, and it is. It's very, very tough, right? But God really is wanting us to hone in on this whole idea of this office or this position, right? Is exactly of what Paul is really getting into that concept, right? Of whether we can talk about deacon and we can talk about eldership, right? Those two very important roles. And teaching and having authority, right, is the greatest differences when we look at servanthood, deaconship, versus teaching and authority, eldership. Right? And it's the reason why that we are trying to promote the best godly ways that we possibly can in order to do, right? Now, I know that churches have been arguing these points since Paul has wrote these, right? And I know that there are just as many of my good godly friends that will probably argue some of the points that I truly hold true when I read these passages in Scripture, as well as there's some things that they agree with, right, that I don't personally agree with. But at the end of the day, it does not change the gospel, right? And I want to make sure that we understand that we are not talking about whether or not a woman is capable or competent in order to teach or exercise authority, because yes, she is, and we want women to do so. Matter of fact, if we didn't, we'd really be struggling in this church. It's the very reason why that we've been praying about deaconship and so many things and servanthood and what we're wanting to do, right? Because without women, our church would really be struggling. And no offense to the men that are here. Thank you for those that showed up, right? But if we are to look predominantly, we know what we see at any given service here at church. And it's not just here, right? It's the church in and of itself, right? We also know that there were women that followed Jesus and were his disciples and helped and done so many other things. And hey, I can't change the desire of people's hearts, but what I'll really hope that we grab is that we're not trying to exercise something that's not been given to us. It's no different than what we're seeing play out with defining marriage, right? It's already been defined. Qualifications have already been defined. We just want to try to adhere to those, right? We want to say that proper leadership, which is teaching, exercising authority, is to be led by the man. And that's not because we're better, right? We can all pick several women that are far greater teachers than I'll ever be, that know the Bible far better than I do. But we want to also make sure that we are doing everything that God has commanded us to do the best way that we possibly can. God does love the church, right? And he loves it, especially when we follow and do what we're supposed to do. People exercising, using their gifts that they have been given, right? It's why we see women flourish, and I don't, right? I know Bobby Joe teaches young kids, and that is a rare abnormal when you look at the school system, right? As you look at males, predominantly they're gym teachers, right? Nothing there's wrong with that, or coaches, or they're high school teachers. But how many do you see work in the lower grades? Only one in this county, and that's scary. If your kids are going to his class, no, come on.
That's an elementary in classroom, and I was the only one in Scott County at one point.
Absolutely.
Over 9 elementary schools.
Absolutely.
You know, and I mean, it's a plea because these kids need it.
Absolutely.
I mean, it was just sad to look and see that big and only have one. Now, not that they're special ed teachers, gym teachers.
Yeah. No, I'm not minimizing those.
But yeah, in the classroom, they were seeing kids every day.
And you know, when you think about that, right, because you see women, first of all, with a lot of compassion, right? You see them with that heart, with that motherly instinct that little toddlers or little kids, right, or elementary students really need with school. Now, not that men can't give it, but more times than other, we're a whole lot more rougher around the edges, right? You know, get up, you ain't hurt, right? We know all those things, whereas women are more consoling and trying to help and trying to lead and guide, as well as kids really feel sometimes more comfortable going to a woman versus a man, right? As you see those things play out. Those gifts are all good, and we want to continue to grow those, right? We're not saying that women should sit on the sidelines where all the men should get the glory. No, we're saying that everybody has a part in God's kingdom, in his ministry. None of us are called to sit, just come in and just get fat, dumb, and happy, right? All of us are called to do something, exercising our gift, whether it's teaching, helping, admonishing, right? All those things, right? We need to be doing something, not just men, right? Not just so that we get the name tag or the title, because guess what? I assure you, it's going to burn off, right? Or it's going to blow off. Either way, none of that's important. We need to be what God has called us to be. Hands down. Hands down. So, as we look at that very, very, very quickly, right? Questions, comments, concerns on what we've just talked about. How do we feel when we think about this one subject? Do we feel that it's fair? I think it's a great question. Do we feel like that is the right way, the right perspective?
I think that's where we're at today. You know, it's dog eat dog world. You know, climbing up that corporate ladder and having that title and, to have it and the best and even when you get that, you're still trying to strive for more because it boils down to Jesus, that I think it's the world we live in and I think we just completely turn our backs on God. We take our country back.
And it's how you define fairness. Are you defining fairness biblically, or are you defining fairness by, worldly standards? I mean,
Right.
we don't even have a conversation with fairness, really, but, I mean, every one of us could go and say, well, this ain't fair, well, this ain't fair, well, that wasn't fair, I mean, so how do you define?
Right.
It can only be that way.
I'm not gonna have to die on the cross like Christ did. So everything's fair, I mean, people just get to that point.
Somebody else? Because ultimately, right, our heart's desire is to be obedient to God, right, for us to operate in the ways. You know, and it's really sad that as we've said and we've talked about, right, that lots of people have grown up in certain ways to where that women would have never prayed in church or would have never spoke up, right, that would have never shared or given testimony or been able to do so many of those things when that at all is not the context of what we're talking about. And how that some men and women or people have skewed the scriptures in order to really penalize good godly things that could have are taking place inside of the church. And you know, it's really sad that it's played out that way over history, right? And the key moment or thing is that we don't fall victim to that. Why do we think that Jesus would have used women, right, to talk about him being risen from the dead? Why would he have sent women there first? Because they were going to be the least likely of people to even be believed. Do you think that anybody in Jewish times would have believed a woman that would have said, "Hey, we went to the tomb and Jesus wasn't there"? They probably were laughed at and mocked. Right? We can see that countless times that he used women inside of furthering his kingdom. Right? It's never been the place to separate, to say only men are advancing the kingdom. Absolutely not. Right? Never the case. We are designed to work together, to carry out, to do those things in given perspective, right? Where God is using each and every one of us in the best way. And that is the hardest part, because we want to spin it to whatever way that we want to. And that doesn't always work the best way by far. We all should be involved in the greatest work ever, right? Sharing the gospel.
That was where my heart was drawn in doing that lesson Wednesday. You know, when he says, "Go ye therefore, make disciples, of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father." I don't believe that was men and women. When he's saying, "Go ye therefore and make disciples," his command is to both.
Yep.
And sometimes I think when we take a command, we think that might have been just for men, as you're thinking of the disciples.
Right.
That was for men and women. Go ye therefore, making disciples of all the nations.
Oh, absolutely. It's the context in and of itself of how important that women ministry is. Right? It's so very important, right? That there's ways that I will never be able to connect to women, because guess what? I'm not a woman.
And we're living now in a nation at a time where women are single, living on their own, whereas in older days they're covering with their father or their mother. Great point. And we're seeing that self movement being really pushed and portrayed, right, to a point that is. It is very scary in and of itself.
That's a great point, Rick, because even in 1 Corinthians, where we were talking about, I don't know which number exactly, 1 Corinthians 14, and it said a woman should remain silent, and if she has a question, go home and ask her husband. Well, now's day and time, there ain't no husband to ask. And if you go ask, a lot of times, maybe he's not involved in church, so what kind of answer are you going to get?
Right.
That's a big point.
And we're still living in that, right? Even moving up from generation to generation, we're still seeing that women are still the driving force of coming to church, bringing the kids to church, all those things, when God never designed it to be that way. And we are actually putting women into positions that is 10 times harder for them. And I don't mean it's because they're not qualified to handle it or they can't handle it. I'm saying that we're putting them into positions to be outside of what God designed for them to be. And really, right, if we were to look at it, if we as men were to live up to the standard that God has called us to, it would actually free women up to be so much more that God had designed for them to be. And it would take tons of burden off them and really put the responsibility, which it already is, on us, where we're going to be held accountable for it. We just may not realize it. Man, of how scary that is. So really the fallback is on men, right? And that is a whole nother night to talk about by far.
Randy made a comment on, I don't know if she did like the messenger or something, but he says it's not that they can't teach, but that they can't exercise authority over man. Yes, biblical preach. So sorry I'm out there to have his back. Apparently your back. And there are women preachers who don't preach women, nothing wrong with that. It's the position of God's order. And she goes on to say God does have an order. Everyone wants a playbook to life, but doesn't want to submit to God's playbook.
Great point.
Who said that, Brad?
Yeah, I think it's like messenger or something. She
Yeah.
would do something.
Ms. Norman said, women teaching is a wonderful gift.
Yes, we agree with that.
Most of my teachers were women in my churches and my school. No way do I believe that it's a sin for them to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, right? Let me make sure that I'm on the record so that everybody understands what I'm saying when what I've said is a sin, right? So I am talking about the exercising of authority as in a position of leadership, right? Not in teaching. Now, I will go as far to say as in Sunday school, right? There are lots of cases where women have sat in and taught in a joint Sunday school class where there are men and women. And as Kimberly said, most of the time the woman done predominantly the teaching. I think that is very, very tricky ground, right? I believe that sitting underneath of that, especially in the scriptures, explaining, teaching those, exercising those, is not where we want to be, right? Now, granted, if it is a couples class and men and women are doing it and it is a joint teaching, I am all for that, right? But right. And in no way, right? I'm wholeheartedly am thankful for lots of women Sunday school teachers that have played out in my life over the years. By far. Without them, I wouldn't know what little that I did know. I assure you. And we wouldn't be having what we have here as well, right? But it is that line, that proper place, right, of what we're talking about. Great. Anybody else? That's good. I love how one comment that I wrote down from one commentary says, no woman or man is or should be sitting on the sidelines in Christian ministry. The question is not whether all men and women should be active in ministry. They should. The only question is how. And I thought it's a great point, a great way to end it. Questions, comments, concerns? I don't know if we covered that in the way that somebody wanted me to. If not, hey, send us something. We'll talk about it some more. I know that was a quick crash of women in the church, right? Nobody, come on.
You know, I listened to Romans. I went through a study in Romans, just a quick study to listen to that. You know, when you think of that, there's the last chapter in Romans, you know, sometimes, you know, I read through it really quick because I couldn't pronounce half the names, but when Paul commends, you know, if you look at that list of all the people that he was commended for ministry in and throughout churches, you know, I don't know specific number on names, 50% of it's probably women that he commended for their work.
Absolutely.
Support and help and service within the church.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we would say that, right? we would say that that is still predominantly taking place right inside the local church today. But man, what if we were to be obedient, right, as men of the church, right? More and more coming alongside doing what we're supposed to do. All right, who's gonna draw one out tonight? Come on, somebody. Who wants to do it? Cam, you gonna draw one out? Close your eyes. You can't even look. That's the one you want. You done looked at it and everything. Let's see what this. It's folded up, so he didn't get to see it. Oh man, here we go.
I think you just need to read it without you reading it.
It's not always great spelling, so I gotta make sure what I'm saying here is always good too. When should we give the pastor a raise? All right. I'm just kidding. Come on. That ain't there. Come on. All right, it says, what are the three layers of heaven and what do they consist of? That's what it says. Y'all think you want me to? I guess I'm gonna have to get those old. What was those things called? Where you put it on there and it just transpose it up here. What was that called? Come on, we used to put the slide on. Overhead projector. Yeah, overhead projector, right? We're going to go way back, right? And I'll just lay it on top of there and y'all can see it. How's that? All right. What are the three layers of heaven and what do they consist of? And I'm not assuming that they're talking about matter. What matter do they consist of? Charmin's tissue. I'll just go ahead and just let the cat out of the bag. Just kidding. Come on, right? All right. So that's where we're going to. Hopefully that will. Yeah, we'll see where we come up. There's lots of conversation that's being talked about that right now. It seems like a lot of end of times talk, which is okay. We're good with that as well. Questions, comments, concerns? A busy week again this week, right? Lots to be in prayer for, lots of prayer requests to mention. And if you're going to watch the ball game, it just come up. Kentucky got beat. Yeah, they're already watching it anyway, right? So they didn't even. All right, let's stand and we're going to pray out of here tonight, right? Lord, we do come to you and just thanking you for our time tonight, and we do thank you for your word, and we thank you for exactly of what it means. And Lord, I do pray that we would.